Magnus Carlsen is the biggest troll in the chess world, and in today's video, he's going to troll Vladimir Kramnik with the move 1f4, also known as the bird's opening. And yes, Magnus actually played this against Vladimir Kramnik in a rapid game in 2017, and it's a good thing Vladimir was not accusing people of cheating back then, because if he was, this game would have sent him off the deep end. Now in the game, of course, Magnus trolls Vladimir Kramnik with the move 1f4. Vladimir is not amused. He plays his best chess in this game. He responds d5, knight f3, knight f6, and now Magnus goes g3 in the spirit of the Leningrad Dutch. Now Kramnik e6, he wants to go bishop e7 and short castles. Very solid idea, but let's see what happens. Here Magnus bishop g2, Kramnik bishop e7, Magnus short castles, and here on move 5, Kramnik plays a really solid move, b5, immediately expanding on the queen side. The idea behind this is that Kramnik went castles here. Magnus on move 6 could go a4, stopping b5 ideas forever. So with that in mind, b5 immediately gaining space on the queen side, also giving that bishop on c8, that wonderful b7 square where it's going to pose white's bishop on g2 very, very effectively. So excellent stuff from Kramnik. Now Magnus d3, logical move, Kramnik bishop b7, and here Magnus has his first big decision of the game besides his decision to troll Vladimir Kramnik. Now from here, he has a wide range of ideas. a4 is playable, b3, e3, knight d2, all of these are good. But instead here, Magnus plays the Leningrad Dutch style move, queen to e1. His idea is he wants to start transferring his queen over to the king side, where he may start a king side attack. All right, interesting stuff. Here Kramnik, not amused, c5, playing very solid chess. Magnus goes c3, bolstering the queen side. And now Kramnik castles, and here Magnus starts some tension on the queen side with the move a4. Okay, very interesting. Here Kramnik, how does he respond? His main options are simply taking on a4, of course, and beyond that, he can bolster b5 with the move a6. Queen to a5 is actually, believe it or not, quite possible. This stops the move a takes b5 from Magnus. But instead of all that, he plays the best move here, simply b4, closing down the queen side and gaining even more space. So far in this game, Vladimir Kramnik on his A game in the bird's opening. Now from here, Magnus, he takes on b4, c takes b4, c takes b4, and now his king is actually quite exposed on this diagonal here. With that in mind, Magnus goes king to h1, good prophylactic move. Now here Kramnik has a choice. There is the very interesting idea for black here, simply playing d4, trying to lock down the center and trying to expose white's weakened dark squares here. So that would have been a very interesting try. It's going to be available for a few more moves. Instead of that, Kramnik playing ultra solid in this game, knight to c6, nothing wrong with that. He wants rook to c8 next. And now here Magnus, he plays a move that looks like it violates different chess principles. That is the move bishop to e3. Oh my goodness, what's the idea behind this? Doesn't that move simply block the pawn on e2? Well, yes it does, but Magnus Carlsen's idea is if black ever does go d4, then that bishop has the retreat squares on f2 or even g1 to go to, and the bishop may be a little bit better placed on these squares versus c1, so not a bad idea by Magnus. Now here the best move for Vladimir is actually d4, but this move is very, very sharp, very double-edged. Magnus would have an interesting game after, say, bishop f2, and perhaps this is what Magnus wanted in the game. So instead of that, Vladimir Kramnik playing very, very solid. He retreats the knight to d7. Interesting move. This does two different things. First of all, that knight could transfer over to the c5 or b6 squares on the queen side, and beyond that, Vladimir opens up the idea of bishop to f6, trying to expose white's weakened dark squares on the queen side. So excellent stuff by Vladimir. Now here Magnus Carlsen, knight b to d2, solid move, and here Vladimir Kramnik, actually it's surprising, but he has to find the right move right away in this position, and that is the move bishop to f6, immediately putting pressure on that queen side. Now real fast, if Vladimir missed that, let's say he played rook to c8, very logical idea. Here white is going to show his idea. He goes knight to b3, and this means white is already threatening a5 ideas, getting space on the queen side. Black is going to lock that down, and then white simply goes queen to d2. And here, white has a very powerful regrouping in the center. So with that in mind, Vladimir Kramnik is trying to throw a curveball and stop this from happening, and bishop to f6, threatening the b2 pawn, is the best way to do that. Now here, Magnus, rook to b1. That is an ugly move to make, but it is the best. That rook is now very passive on the b file. And Kramnik, in this game, he is sticking to his guns, playing very solid. He goes rook to e8. The rook is a little bit better on the 8 square, and maybe he wants to go e5 at some point in the future. future. So very interesting. And now here for Magnus Carlsen, what the heck is his idea in this position? Well, it turns out he has a very aggressive resource that he could use right here or on the next move, and that is the idea of g4. Oh boy, g4 would gain more space on the king side, threaten g5, hitting the bishop on the f6 square, and after that, Magnus could even follow up with the idea of h4 to h5, simply trying to start a crazy attack on the king side. So stick around to see if Magnus actually does that in the game. All right, here Magnus, knight to b3, decent idea, rewriting the knight, opening up the d2 square for the queen, a5 from black. Of course, Magnus was threatening a5 perhaps in some lines, and now Magnus here, he shows his idea, g4, it does happen, gaining space on the king side, threatening g5. What is Vladimir going to do? Well, first of all, let's see what happens if Vladimir ignores this threat. Let's say he goes, say, rook to c8, logical move. Here, Magnus is going to go g5, hitting the bishop. Of course, the only square for the bishop is e7, and now Magnus can simply go queen to f2. The queen and the rook very well lined up on the f-file. Perhaps Magnus would want to go f5 or even h4 to h5 in the future. So this kind of position would give Magnus exactly what he wants in the game. So with that in mind, here Vladimir goes g6, a very good move. His idea is if Magnus goes g5, he wants to retreat bishop g7, and that bishop will be very well placed on the g7 square, defending the king side and attacking white's queen side. Now from here, instead of g5, Magnus simply goes queen to f2, maintaining all the different options. Very good idea. And here Vladimir, he retreats the bishop to the g7 square, but this turns out to be slightly premature. So for example, instead of this, rook to c8 or a bunch of other moves may have been more promising. The idea behind this is if Magnus goes g5, this may be premature from Magnus, and here Vladimir can simply retreat bishop g7, and it's not really clear how Magnus is going to continue the attack. So going back to the position in the game, here after bishop to g7 from Vladimir, now Magnus does not have to go g5. Instead, he can simply wait and maybe even threaten f5 ideas at some point. That may be even stronger. Now, you may be wondering, what happens if Magnus simply goes f5 right away? I mean, technically that is a playable move. Well, let's see what happens. f5, now the best move for Vladimir is taking with the e-pawn. E takes f5. Now Magnus takes back, and black doesn't have to take right away on f5. He can simply go queen to e7, and here the computer seems to think white is a little bit better, but I'm not so sure. I'm kind of liking how black's play is slowly evolving here. And in the game, Magnus Carlsen seemed to agree. He did not go for this. Instead, he jumps forward with the knight to the d4 square, but the question is which knight? Well, in the game, he jumps forward with the b knight, knight b to d4. Interesting idea. However, I do want to point out the strongest move here is actually knight f to d4. Now, this may look a little bit puzzling. I mean, Magnus Carlsen wants to attack on the king side, and for that reason, it may seem more logical to have the knight over on f3 instead of over here on the b3 square. Well, that's true in theory. However, by going knight f to d4, white unlocks the queen and the rook on the f-file. It makes f5 ideas much more dangerous, and the knight is surprisingly doing a decent job on the queen side on b3. So this would have been the better way to do it. Instead, knight b to d4, not a bad move. The difference is if black doesn't take the knight on the d4 square, then that knight on f3 is simply clogging up the f-file and making it harder for Magnus to achieve the f5 break in this position. Now here, Vladimir, what's the best way to maintain the tension? Well, it turns out queen e7 is the way. You don't have to take on d4 yet. The knight is blocking the f-file, and here Vladimir Kramnik has a very, very solid weakness-free position. However, instead of that, he starts to go a little bit astray. So far, he's playing nearly a perfect game, but here knight takes d4, not necessarily the best idea. And here's why. Here Magnus simply takes back with the bishop, not the knight. Now the bishops are threatening to be traded off, and if that dark square bishop leaves the black position, his king side is going to be so weak. Now Vladimir, rook to c8, solid move, getting that rook on the open c-file, good stuff. Magnus does the same, rook b to c1. Of course, he has some alternatives. Bishop takes g7 and even h4 were also interesting. However, Magnus, rook b c1, keeping things simple. Now here Vladimir takes on d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, and both sides trade a pair of rooks. Rook takes c1, rook takes c1. Now here, just take a look at Magnus Carlsen's position. I don't know how he always seems to do it in these games, but suddenly now that the bishop is off g7, black's dark squares on the king side are looking so weak. f5 is dangerous. Magnus may even have h4 to h5 ideas. I mean, Magnus Carlsen's opening with 1f4 somehow turning out to be quite playable in this game. Now here, Vladimir Kramnik, queen b6, excellent move, pinning that knight to the queen on the f2 square. Vladimir is a certified G here, excellent stuff. Now Magnus, he has to do something about that pin. He decides rook f1 is the way. First of all, you defend the queen. Now the knight is free to go wherever it wants, not worrying about queen takes f2 ideas. Now here, Vladimir, once again, he has a tough decision to make. What the heck does he do in this position? Well, it turns out there isn't a whole lot that he can do actively. Instead, he simply has to kind of wait around. Knight f6 could have been a move, perhaps h6, but instead here, he goes f6. Now, this move is very double-edged. I don't particularly like it here. It's just creating more and more weaknesses in his position, and Magnus Carlsen seems to agree. He starts the aggression on the king side with the move h4. The threat is h5, or maybe even f5 in some lines, just blowing open the king side. All right, Vladimir, rook to f8, solid idea. Trying to oppose white's queen and rook with a rook of his own, not bad. And here, Magnus, king to g1. Once again, just further supporting the queen on the f2 square. Not a bad idea from him at all. All right, here, Vladimir, he's showing the idea of f6 earlier. He breaks in the center with the move e5. He is done waiting. Decent idea. Let's see how it plays out. Now, Magnus, knight to b3, offering that queen trade. We have the tension with the queens here. What's going to happen? Well, it's a little bit of a game of chicken. If either side takes the queen, it's going to help the opponent develop their pieces better. For example, if Magnus takes on b6, knight takes b6 helps the knight. Whereas on the other hand, if Vladimir takes queen takes f2, Magnus recaptures with the king, and that helps him centralize his king. So with that in mind here, Vladimir, the best move for him is going to be simply bishop to a8. The idea of this is if the queens come off, and if white ever threatens knight takes a5, and if white captures that pawn, the knight on there will not be able to hit the bishop if the bishop is back on the a8 square, whereas on b7 it is quite vulnerable. So overall, bishop a8, best move. However, here instead, Vladimir Kramnik, he loses the game of chicken. He takes the queen first, but this only helps Magnus Carlsen. King takes f2. His king is now closer to the middle of the board. All right, here, Vladimir, e takes f4. Decent idea, but Magnus Carlsen doesn't care. He simply jumps in with the knight to the a5 square. Knight takes a5, and now we see the purpose of bishop a8 earlier. Now the bishop has to go back with a loss of tempo. Bishop a8, and here Magnus has the time he needs to seize control of the c-file. Oh, good stuff. Magnus stopping rook to c8 ideas from Vladimir. Now Vladimir, knight to e5, threatening the pawn on the g4 square, but Magnus, simple defense, bishop to f3. All right, from here, Vladimir d4, trying to lock down the position, but this move gives up the c4 square for the knight, and Magnus jumps in, and here in this position, we have so much tension. I mean, black can take the knight on c4, the bishop. What's going to happen? Well, here, the best move for black is going to be knight takes f3. The idea is very simple. Here, white has to recapture with the pawn. Of course, the bishop is also attacking f3. King takes f3, not possible. And here, black simply goes rook to c8, opposing the rook on c1, pinning the knight, and black is going to have decent drawing chances here. However, instead of that, he goes for the other idea, bishop takes f3, but this turns out to be a big mistake. All right, first of all, obviously, you cannot take with the e-pawn. E takes f3 is suicide. Here, black obviously goes knight takes d3 with the fork on the rook and the king. Not good, my friend. So, of course, you don't do that. Instead, here, Magnus Carlsen, he jumps forward with the knight. Knight takes e5. And now both sides technically have pieces that are hanging. What the heck's going to happen here? Well, Vladimir does not want to go d takes e5, because then after king takes f3, white here essentially has a winning endgame. Black is never going to be able to create a pass pawn with e4, and meanwhile, Magnus has the protected pass pawn on the queen side. That is going to be too much. So obviously, with that in mind, here the move for Vladimir Kramnik is bishop takes e2. Okay, very interesting. Now, what's going to happen? Magnus, he jumps in with the knight, knight d7, trying to fork the rook and the pawn on f6. And here's the idea. After rook f7 from Vladimir Kramnik, Magnus does not take the bishop on the e2 square. No, instead, he takes the pawn on f6 with check. Oh, knight takes f6 check. Vladimir is first to take the knight. Rook takes f6, and only now Magnus takes the bishop. King takes e2. Okay, the idea here is Magnus now has a rook endgame. Both sides have the same number of pawns. However, that pass pawn on a4 is an absolute monster. And Magnus has one goal here. Simply push that pawn down the board to promote. Let's see how he does it. Now Vladimir gives the king a check, and Magnus simply slides away. King f2. Now Vladimir king f7, bringing his king into the game. Very, very important. But Magnus Carlsen does not care. He simply goes for his plan A, pushing that pawn down the board. Past pawns must be pushed. And here Kramnik has a very difficult defense. If he goes something like rook to a6, that rook is going to be passive for the rest of the game. That is suicide. So with that in mind, he lashes out with the move g5, trying to create some sort of counterplay on the king side. Not a bad idea. Here Magnus h takes g5. He sees a free pawn. He takes the free pawn. But now Vladimir king to g6. His idea, maybe I can get something going here. All right, well, Magnus Carlsen not amused. Rook c5, simply defending the pawn on g5. Vladimir Kramnik, what the heck is he going to do now? Well, he goes f3, sacrificing a pawn to try and throw Magnus off his game. However, there is a really cool idea behind this. If Magnus does nothing, then the threat is rook to e2 with a fork on the king and the pawn on b2. And instead, if Magnus takes the pawn as he did in the game, king takes f3, then the move is rook to e3, threatening the pawn on d3 and the king. All right, Magnus, king f4, he just keeps going. Vladimir takes the pawn on d3, but now the problem for Vladimir is a6, and how the heck is he going to stop that pawn? I don't know. Obviously, a3 is guarded by the pawn on b2. Rook a3, not an option. Vladimir goes rook d1. The idea trying to go rook to a1 next, but Magnus Carlsen blocks the idea. Rook to a5. Magnus the party pooper. Oh no, Vladimir tries to push his pawn d3, but Magnus Carlsen, he's on top of it. King e3. He stops the pawn, and there is simply no defense for Magnus Carlsen's idea of a7 and a8, queening the pawn, and that means Magnus Carlsen here wins. Vladimir Kramnik resigns on the spot. He has to admit defeat to Magnus Carlsen's audacious opening with the move 1f4. Oh boy, is that embarrassing. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.